Hello, everybody, and it's great to see you all here. Me and Ronen are very happy to be here and to share our work in progress and the ideas we develop on transformation in industrial relations in general, and more specifically, the transformation of trade unions in an age of liberalization. Our analysis focuses on a non-trivial encounter between economists, agents of the market, and trade unions, the agent that at least ideally seek to limit or counter the market and its impact. We look on the entrance of these market agents, economists, to the social agents, the unions, and ask about its causes and implications. Our analysis reveals that economists serve as a means to cope with the liberalization of industrial relations, with the rise in employers' discretion. The consequences of this trend are in turn the entrenchment of liberalization through depoliticization, rationalization of workers' representation and labor regulation, and finally, the introduction of market-friendly ideas and policies into trade unions' agenda. But we will start from the beginning. We'll take a few steps backwards in order to frame our analysis in its proper context. Following Baccaro and Howell and many other scholars, our story begins with the liberalization of industrial relations, with the decline in union power, the growing segmentation of labor markets, and of course, the consequent rise of income inequality. Slide. As previously shown by Howell, Payora, and Safford, and others, through this process, the state takes a more active role in labor regulation. Law and litigation partially displace collective bargaining, and individualist logic rise on the expense of collective action. This process, often called juridification, goes hand in hand with increased professionalization of industrial relations that can be seen in the rise of legal experts, professional lawyers in workers' representation and in general in the class struggle and its regulation. Slide. During this time, we see the growing importance of economists that gain influence in the representation of class interests in collective labor regulation. These agents are not foreign to industrial relations. Nonetheless, their growing influence represents a qualitative change, from assisting in the backstage to leading agents in the front line of the class struggle. Economists, we claim, represent a new layer of professionalization in trade unions and industrial relations more generally. This layer is added to previous juridification while introducing a new logic of action. While legal experts promoted the human rights logic, governed by rules and striving to protect individual rights, economists pursue a different logic of incentives, rationality, efficiency. In the face of their growing dominance, we ask, again, what explains the rise of economists in industrial relations? What are its implications? Our analysis is based on the case of Israel, which presents a rapid process of liberalization and decentralization of industrial relations since the early 1980s. As a reaction, last 2 decades also demonstrate union revitalization, seen in their strive for renewed power. At this period of revitalization, we also saw a rise in economic professionalization, represented in entrance of economists to central roles in the main trade union federation in Israel, the Histadrut. In order to understand this trend, our analysis is mainly based on semi-structured interviews with many professional economists as well as union officials. Now, diving into our findings, economists in unions is again not a new phenomenon. Economists were there already in the early 80s, providing both macro and microeconomic data for union officials. Though since the early 2000s, we see their position and roles change dramatically. In this process, unions became increasingly dependent on professional economic advice, on economist skills with numbers, calculations in collective bargaining. collective bargaining started to rely on econometric analysis of workers' demands. And as economists became more dominant, they also started to influence the demand themselves and the goals of workers and unions. Entering collective bargaining, economists became repeated players, developing unique, broad perspective on the sectoral norms, on compensation models, and finally on the limits of collective bargaining. In this process, these repeated players developed close relations with other repeated players in the other side of the table, mainly employers, professional economists, allowing them to monopolize knowledge on formal and informal practices in labor regulation and collective agreements. Through these steps, economists implemented their knowledge as essential part of collective bargaining, providing necessary translation to workers' interests and demands from words or stomach aches to numbers, and gradually defining workers' and unions' goals in order to make them fit to existing models or existing norms. And at this point, I want to pass the mic to Ronen, that will further show our findings and contextualize them into a broader theoretical framework.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So following what Assaf already presented, right, this phenomenon of economist involvement, what we ask is what drives the economic officialization of industrial relations in Israel, at least, and what are the consequences. And we start with what we found about the drivers for economic officialization. Before I will show our empirical results, firstly, a brief literature review about what we already know about the political influence of economists from the vast literature on that. And generally, we could say that, the literature on that generally suggests that, when policymakers become dependent and need the help of experts, then economic experts get into, they ask for the help of these experts in context of crisis and uncertainty and complexity. And we thought that the same would be relevant in the context of economic liberalization, which actually enhances the complexity and uncertainty for unions in the process of collective bargaining. And there are several reasons for that, or several processes that are related to that. One is the outsourcing and the enhanced outsourcing and enhanced market competition, which enhance uncertainty and complexity of industrial relations. Another is the decentralization of collective agreements, meaning that unions work more at a firm level and need to have more economic knowledge with regard to what's going on in the industry in general, in other firms, what is going on in other collective agreements in the industry. And also an additional aspect of economic liberalization, which enhances the complexity of labor relations, is the marketization of workers' compensation. Workers nowadays are much more dependent in their salaries for profit-based. Their salaries are much more dependent on profits-based incentives and performance-based incentives. And so how this all plays out in the context of Israel based on our empirical analysis. One thing we saw is that econometric skills are indeed required for several reasons. One is the various technicalities involved in collective agreements. For example, the need to include performance-based or profit-based compensation in the collective agreement, or to cope with the variance, enhanced variance, which exists in employment arrangements within the same firm. And for example, one economist explained to us is that the dialogue has become much more complex. You used to do horse trading. We said that we want 5%, the management says 3%, we go on strike, close on 4% and move forward. But today, this is not the case. We're talking about performance bonuses and different kinds of bonuses based on profits and excellence grants and differential promotion budgets. In addition, the econometric skills are required for this kind of reality check to assess what are the actual implications of certain demands by workers on the firms, and to which degree the firms are indeed financially constrained or not. For example, one union leader told us that they did an in-depth economic analysis and saw that on the face of it, the company has the financial ability to pay the bonus. I mean, the fact that, and this is again the continue of this citation, the fact that they presented the management that there is no financial possibility or ability to pay was absolutely not true, and we could not prove this without the economists. And this brings us also to the issue of the balance of power, because economists are used in this sense also to counter employers' tactical maneuvers within the collective bargaining process. So more generally, we know that economic liberalization is manifested in the decline of unions' traditional power resources, and we suggest that economists and the economic knowledge could be used by and seen by unions as an alternative power resource, which they can use. And indeed, we saw in the empirical analysis that economic professionals were seen as a power resource and see themselves as such. For example, being able to provide crucial knowledge to the workers, economic information, but also collective bargaining know-how. For example, one of the economists told us that he knows how to speak the language of the Ministry of Finance. And another said that the managements also know how to appreciate the fact that we try to speak in a language that is more comprehensible to them, a language of numbers. What we also learned is that economists are considered as objective agents and credible mediators, and this allows them in many cases to access employers' information which employers were not willing to give to the workers, but were willing to give to the economists who represented the workers and the unions. You know, we'll skip that because of time limitations. And move now to what are the consequences of economic professionalization. So from the literature, we know that, again, the literature on economists in general, we know that economists tend to support economic liberalization and greater influence of market mechanisms, and also that economists tend to support depoliticization and de-democratization of economic policymaking. And we also know that economists are identified with a more scientific approach to public policy questions and with values of rationality and efficiency. So how this is expected to play out in the context of labor relations? So firstly, we expect the economists who are involved in these relations to reject the view of industrial relations as a political class struggle, and to think about it more as a problem that has to be solved and the need to reach an equilibrium. And in addition, that economists would be more open to market-friendly solutions and to accommodate and to adopt, or be more open to see the situation from the employer's view. And indeed, what we saw in the empirical analysis is that, and this I think was like the most probably common theme among the economists that he interviewed, that they see labor relations and collective bargaining as a problem that needs to be solved by serving the long-term interest of both sides, and of the workers and the company. For example, one of the economists told us that he thinks that the main agenda of the economics division in the Histadrut, in the Labor Federation, is to bring balanced value to both parties. It means that there is no desire here to just improve the conditions of the employees. Rather, our goal is to make agreements that encourage the service to the citizens, if it is in the public sector, and in the private sector, the profitability of the company. In the same line, we saw economists reject an ideological or political approach to the situation, promoting a rational discourse, explaining that actually they bring a rational discourse in contrast to the more emotional and irrational discourse that they identify among trade union representatives. And we should acknowledge also that in many cases, economists identify with the economist on the other side of the table. In many cases, an economist who represents now unions in the past has represented employers and vice versa. We also see the economists support the continued liberalization of labor relations through the adoption of market-friendly arrangements like differential performance-based and profit-based compensation, for example, and also that they as I mentioned, see the situation from the eyes of the employers. For example, one question that they ask themselves, according to one of them, is how do we give flexibility to the management to promote workers in a differential way, and on the other hand, not weaken the unions and also give their place. So I will just conclude with saying that, again, the connection between these two entities, the economics professionals and labor unions, is not trivial. And I think the main takeaway of our paper is that the drivers and consequences of economic professionalization of industrial relations are linked together. On the one hand, it is an opportunity for workers and unions to improve their position in the context of liberalization of these relations. But at the same time, it reflects a substantive change in industrial relations, which furthers their liberalization. And so thanks a lot for your attention, and we look forward for your comments.
Thank you for such a great paper. Normally we would go straight through, but since you have time constraints, would it be better for both of you if you got any comments or questions now, or that we go straight through? Just asking in case you'd prefer it.
I think we can go straight through, and Assaf, in any case, will remain here until the end of the session. So thanks a lot for
you can take notes. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. So I'm next on the list. Let me just share my screen. All right, can everyone see it? Okay, great. I'll move this down. All right, so thank you to the organizers of Network E for accepting this paper that Donato and I are calling Still Three Models of Capitalism, Resilient State Traditions, and New Inflationary Hard Times. My name is Dan. I'm a postdoc at Brown University. Donato wasn't able to make it, so I'm also presenting on behalf of him. In this paper, his expertise had more to do with the German case and the general theoretical framing, and so just keep this in mind as I'm presenting this. All right. So today I'm going to, in this presentation, preview our argument. I'll discuss sort of the classic literature we're all familiar with on the traditions of state capitalism. I'll overview our research design and the energy shock that brought on by the Russian invasion of Ukraine that serves as our sort of experiment. And then I'll delve into our three cases, France, Germany, and the UK, and their big picture policy responses to this energy shock. And then I'll conclude. So our argument in brief is as follows. We're speaking to a classic long-standing debate on the models of capitalism in the field of comparative political economy, specifically on the convergence versus resilience debate on which models of capitalism drive outcomes. Regarding convergence, as we know here, many point to the homogenizing pressures of quote-unquote isations, whether it's economic financial globalization, liberalization, and the Europeanization as converging models of capitalism into one type. Now, while these pressures are very much present, there is still disagreement between scholars on what truly drives state and policy and economic outcomes, and whether, in fact, and how much varieties of capitalism still do. And so with this debate in mind, Donato and I asked the question of how different countries respond to a common exogenous shock. And we think that the current energy crisis we're in is a perfect natural experiment for testing whether these European models of capitalism are truly converging to their core, or whether varieties of capitalism are still holding and whether they sort of reemerge in crisis. And in fact, it was during an energy crisis in the 1970s in which the field of comparative political economy emerged in the first place. So this is a great way to continue this tradition with another inflationary supply side shock. So we've designed a case study on three models of sort of classic three models of capitalism drawn from the work of Vivian Schmidt, and asking how each country responds to this energy shock, namely France, Germany, and the UK, as I said earlier. And in the end, we're going to argue that these old patterns actually persist in these new hard and uncertain times, and state traditions are resilient despite these very powerful homogenizing pressures that we're all aware of. And we will also argue even more surprisingly that the statism is even greater than one would suspect across all cases, which is again in contrast to these convergence arguments. So to ask this question, we rely upon the following typology advanced by Vivian Schmidt. We found it a bit more comprehensive for this situation than the sort of traditional varieties of capitalism typology, not only because it was advanced as an update to VOC, but Schmidt also has a more state-centered categorization, which is helpful in crisis. It allows you to ask how states adjust, intervene, and compensate, as you see on this table on the right. And again, with an energy crisis, there is a need for a much more active state. And so this is important to map here. So again, with the three cases, the UK is our neoliberal model, right? It's more market capitalism characterized by the price mechanism and adherence to free markets. Perhaps it can have some statist traits. Then the German neo-corporatist model, it's more managed capitalism characterized by consensus within policy networks. And then the French statist model, which is state capitalism characterized by hierarchy and more unilateral decision-making. And not only do the UK, Germany, and France map onto these three different models of capitalism, but they also had different vulnerabilities to Russia's weaponization of gas. And in our opinion, it makes our study even more interesting. And so this graph we have here is one way to map the exogenous shock of the energy crisis. And so the y-axis is gas share of total energy. The x-axis is share of gas imports from Russia. And then the size of the points is fiscal compensation from the state as a share of GDP. And then the vertical line we have is the x-axis mean, and the horizontal line is the y-axis mean. And these lines split the sample of European countries into 4 quadrants, from low vulnerability in the bottom left to high vulnerability in the top right. And as you can see, our 3 cases highlighted in blue, I'm sorry if it's not perfectly clear. Our 3 cases populate 3 different quadrants. Germany has high vulnerability in the top right with both high gas reliance and high Russian gas reliance. The UK has medium vulnerability with high gas but low Russian reliance, and this is because the UK mostly imports gas from Norway. And then France, due to its reliance on nuclear power, has low levels of gas reliance and low levels of Russian gas reliance. Now, I want to add a caveat here, and it's important to note that the energy crisis raised energy prices everywhere. So not importing from Russian gas alone is not necessarily a shield, but still this gives us an overall picture of pre-existing energy mixes and does shape vulnerability. So on to our 3 cases. We split each country into 3 policy domains: energy policy, labor market policy, and social policy and industrial policy. And starting with France, the one takeaway is that despite comparatively low impact and energy vulnerability, the state was quite active, as one would expect. With energy policy, the state set immediate energy price caps by decree on the ODF below market rates. It also very much invested and strengthened its support for nuclear power. And again, this is what the state already did in the 1970s during the last energy crisis. It just, more than any other country to deal with the crisis, it invested fully in nuclear power. Maybe Sweden was in 2nd place after that. And then Macron advanced un plan de sobriété, and this basically was a massive plan across sectors to reduce energy consumption, could regulate temperature, insulation, and a lot of guidelines for buildings and industry. And then the government banned new oil and gas boilers while reimbursing energy efficiency changes in homes, and also offered EV tax credits. Now, as far as labor market and social policy go, the minimum wage in France is indexed to inflation, and that goes back to the 1950s, so that was a help. There was also unilateral from the state determination of moderate public sector wages by the Treasurer. And then households got multiple €100 payments. There were fuel rebates, energy subsidies, and a 4% increase in welfare funding, and the rent cap also increased. Now, with industrial policy, the state has a long history, the French state, of picking winners, and we saw this again. Total was to oversee the LNG terminal building to import more gas. One coal plant was reopened. Otherwise, a lot of the winners were energy companies that were selected. They were allowed to sell energy at higher market prices. They had decrease for solar construction, decreased and frozen. And then the state, as it did in the 70s, also announced significant funding to the tune of €1 billion to finance new nuclear reactors. And currently the state actually favors a public takeover of the EDF. Now I'm going to talk about the UK, and the takeaway is, though the UK had medium vulnerability, you could still see a clear market orientation in a lot of what it did, but it was a little bit more status than one would expect. But it also didn't pick winners like France. It was more just adhering to the market. So regarding energy policy, the UK partly has a high reliance on natural gas because Margaret Thatcher liberalized the energy sector to undermine coal strikes in the 80s. And again, as I said earlier, it imports gas primarily from Norway. Also, the state decreased permit and planning times for renewables. It deregulated land use policy and reduced the VAT. It also lifted a gas fracking ban and relicensed oil development in the North Sea and reopened a lot of their coal plants. And then they also did implement a price cap on energy to shield consumers at the expense of firms. Labor market and social policy was a bit thinner. A fund was created to supplement low-income household energy bills. And then there was also a means-tested payment, again, very sort of liberal strategy to households, the £650. It was most considered it insufficient. And then the largest measure was £1.5 billion to renovate social and low-income housing. Now, with industrial policy, this is quite interesting. The price cap that was initially set to shield consumers at the expense of firms was increased little by little over 2022 due to firm lobbying. And many firms were bailed out, their profit, to maintain their profits, they were bailed out by the government. And then all carbon and non-carbon energy sources were expanded and deregulated. There was less licensing, more contracts and more approval again. So this wasn't like France that mostly supported, say, nuclear and renewables. They were sort of going all in on carbon and everything else. And £120 million were spent for nuclear project expansion, 15 million for heat pumps, and 635 million for building efficiency. There was some austerity as well, some of it green. There were only loans to energy firms that were not, quote unquote, failing or being mismanaged. Now, as far as the German case goes, this is more the expertise of my co-author. But the takeaway is, despite high vulnerability, there was a very energy vulnerability and high cost. There was a delayed response, and it was far more coordinated than you would expect. But it actually is in line with managed capitalism, right? So as far as energy policy goes, there was no immediate unilateral regulation of energy prices. And there was actually a very late establishment of the Gas Price Commission in the autumn of 2022 to regulate markets. And this was based on negotiation and negotiated decisions between employers, unions, and economic experts who continue to show up every time when the Germans make policies in this time. And as far as labor market and social policy goes, at the federal level, there was the concertine action, which was social partners and economic experts were summoned to the chancellery. And then national social policy and social partnerships were more about enhancing the capacity of inflation internalization by sectoral partners. There was strong compensatory social policy and federal money to fund firm level inflation compensatory bonuses. As well, with state regulation for minimum wage increases, that more translated into law decisions that were first negotiated and then agreed upon by social partners. I can't pronounce this German word, but it basically means the minimum wage commission, and the same people sit on these every time, right? It's the network composed of employers, unions, and economic experts Again, the big takeaway here is that the state is coordinating here and it's playing this orchestrating role and being inclusive. Now, with industrial policy, it was more statist than we'd expect. There was massive and disproportionate aid to firms within the EU's temporary framework on state aid. There was nationalizations of alien firms in strategic sectors, which you see more in France, and particularly in energy and inflation. And there was extensive use of the KfW to provide subsidized loans and guarantees to the private sector. So these are our sort of tentative conclusions and next steps. So despite 3 decades of these convergence hypotheses, in this time of economic uncertainty and shock, national governments continue to revert and differ remarkably in their modes and logics of economic policy making. By and large, we saw 3 distinct logics of the state market nexus in Europe: liberal capitalism in the UK, statism in France, and managed capitalism in Germany. And if anything, we saw across cases, particularly in the UK and Germany, there was actually a direction of greater state interventionism. And now, will this reverse the 3-decade-long trajectory of market-enhancing integration in Europe? We definitely think it's too early to tell, but this seems to be a direction of travel, and this could be further reinforced by geopolitical tensions with other blocs that have been disrupting. Now, our study has many limitations, but one main one is that we only looked at the mode of public policy making and the state market nexus. There are many other ways to look at this. As well, there are people studying the energy crisis right now that are far more granular in their approach and really cataloging policies, and we stayed more big picture. And then as far as future steps go, in addition to writing, we want to match these outcomes to models of capitalism and then compare these policy outcomes across these national varieties. And that's everything for now, and thank you for your attention. And now we have one more paper, and I'm looking forward to it. Liberalized unions, the causes and consequences of economic professionalization. Oh no, I'm sorry, we just had that one. Varieties of post-war settlements, Germany in a comparative perspective. I was reading in order there. All right, take it away.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Ryosuke Amiya from Tokyo, and I'm very happy to make a presentation here. And my paper is rather different from the other 2 papers in that my analysis is historical analysis and not an analysis of current affairs. Still, I hope it will shed some lights on the current debate on the political economy models in Europe, which is thematized in the previous 2 papers, and hopefully have some connections with other 2 papers. So let us begin. In the analysis of the current situation in Europe, the terms like a social market economy and ordoliberalism, which are of German origin, have been attracting attention. For example, Bob Hanke says in the LSE blog that we are all ordoliberals now. In order to criticize austerity orientation of the European Central Bank and Germany, many books and articles have been put a special focus on ordoliberalism, which has underlain post-war German political economy. In this perspective, Germany is regarded as a leader or hegemon. And in fact, in the Treaty on the European Union, the word social market economy, which are also of German origin, is contained. In fact, it has been commonplace for years to treat Germany as a paradigmatic example in comparison with the United States or Japan. The variety of capitalism paradigm originated by Hall and Soskis counterposes LME, liberal market economy, such as the United States, against coordinated market economy, CME, which is based on the German model of a political economy. I quote some of the important passages from Hall and Soskis, 2001. However, it is not appropriate to regard Germany as exemplary, at least until the 1960s. In a classic treatise on comparative capitalism, Andrew Schofield has shown that many countries in Europe had introduced planning, but there are two exceptions. One is the United States, of course, but the other is West Germany at the moment, whose chapter is entitled Market Ideology. Similarly, in a book series dealing with planning practice of various countries, the volume on West Germany is entitled Politics of Non-Planning. It means that as of the mid-1960s, Germany was a unique country characterized by a lack of economic planning. So here we encounter the puzzle. Germany is, on the one hand, treated as a coordinated economy at the enterprise or intra-sector level. But on the other hand, there was no planning mechanism at the macro coordination level. So I'd like to focus on this puzzle. Are these three images contradictory? No, if we properly define their respective scope. As ordoliberalism denies government's guiding role through economic planning and intervention in economic processes. However, negative view on government intervention does not preclude informal coordination on a company or sector basis, on which the CME concept focuses. So this paper focuses on the former aspect and examines the formation process of a unique political economy of post-war West Germany. For that purpose, this paper traces the trajectory of the social democratic project of economic democracy. By examining how the economic democracy project has failed, this paper examines why macroeconomic coordination mechanism has been lacking in Germany, in spite of the sure presence of relevant ideas. As a result, for that purpose, this paper focuses on the corporatist deliberative bodies, which has been involved in macroeconomic management. Because of their small impact on actual economic performance, these institutions have been neglected in most comparative research. However, it should be noted that this type of institutions has flourished across post-war Europe. It was one of Europe's answers after the Great Depression and dictatorship, which had aimed to stabilize democracy and reconcile capitalism and democracy by integrating labor movements. A representative example is the Socio-Economistische Raad of the Netherlands, which was established in 1950, which has played a role in the operation of Dutch corporatism. Belgium also has the Central Europe Economic Council and a Labor Council, Conseil National du Travail, 1952. And the latter has acquired semi-legislative power in the 1970s. In contrast, the French Economic Council, Conseil Economique, and the Italian Economic and Labor Council have not played a major role, although they are based on constitutional provisions. And we have a Wirtschaftsdirektorium experiment in Austria in 1951 by legislation. But it was declared unconstitutional by the Austrian Constitutional Court. It was replaced by the informal parity committee, which had functioned as the core of Austrian corporatism. And also, we know that European integration has a corporatist body at its top from the beginning. For example, ECSC has a consultative committee from the beginning, and the EEC has European Economic and Social Committee from the beginning. In view of these examples, it is all the more remarkable that post-war Germany attempts post-German attempts at formal and informal macro cooperativism have all ended in failure. The most famous example is the concerted action from 1966 by the Grand Coalition government in the 1960s. And some might remember that the Alliance for Jobs was the flagship project of the Red-Green Coalition government from 1998. But both failed in the end. And we check this anomaly of German cases by quantitative indices. By Hugh Compton's Index for Macro Policy Coordination, Austria and Sweden have the highest value of 10 in the early 1970s at the apex of corporatism. To the contrary, Germany stays at 5 and falls below Britain. In Yelefissel's ICTWSS dataset, we have an institutionalized tripartite consultation score from 1960s. Throughout the first half of the 1960s, Germany continued to score 0, which is the lowest among West European countries. This lack of macro tripartite consultation is all the more curious, as we know that Germany is the first country to enact legislations which have enabled the employee to be represented at the company board in the 1950s. And the second country is Netherlands, but the enactment is in 1971, which is 20 years later than a German case. And other countries have only followed suit as late as 1970s and 80s. There is no decisive structural factor that divides Germany from neighboring countries, such as the power configuration of the left against the right, or the strength of the trade unions, or economic traditions. Here, we see an example in the Weimar Constitution. The Weimar Constitution prescribed the establishment of the National Economic Council, and the Provisional National Economic Council was actually established as an interim measure. In fact, the establishment of a macroeconomic deliberate body have been a hotly debated topic for some time. It can even be said that it was a relatively consensual issue in labor conflict. Then, how come post-war West Germany has been characterized by the lack of economic deliberation and agencies, and also the lack of economic planning? To answer these questions, this paper traces the process of post-war regime formation with special emphasis on the strategic decisions of the labor movement in the arenas of party policies and group politics. The analysis is based on extensive investigation of published and unpublished German documents in the post-World War II period, mainly at the Archive of Social Democracy in Bonn. I have consulted the minutes of the SPD Executive Council and the Economic Policy Committee. The documents and the minutes of the trade union organs and the documents related to Fritz Tarnow was also consulted. And of course, I used many published documents in German, like Äquivalenz zur Geschichte der deutschen Gewerkschaftsbewegung im 20 Jahren 2000. And I also checked contemporary articles in journals and magazines. And as a result of analysis, I would like to stress 3 points. And first, of course, Allied occupation policy had some impact on German post-war political economy. But also we highlight 2 strategic decisions by the Social Democratic Party and trade unions. In the party political arena, most important turning points were decisions made by the Social Democratic Party to go into opposition in 1947 and 1949. Especially after the 1949 federal election, the Social Democrats chose not taking part in the coalition talks and therewith narrowed the path to the grand coalition type of governing practice, which might lead to the institutionalization of a macroeconomic deliberative body. Even after the establishment of the first Adenauer government, dominated by the Christian Democrats, there remained some leeway. In general terms, Christian Democrats across Europe were not hostile to those corporatist organs, and the German Christian Democratic Party had non-negligible trade union faction, which had advocated similar reforms with social democratic trade unionists. Here, the trade union herself chose a strategy which closed the way to the macro-corporatist institutions. The key factor here is the fact that the trade union already had important fait accompli, so-called parity co-determination at the Board of Supervisors and the labor director in the management of steel industry in their hands. They traded its preservation and the extension to the coal industry for their support of Adenauer government's foreign policy, discarding the idea of macroeconomic deliberative bodies. As a result, rather liberal political economy, which is characterized by the separation of politics and economy, was established. It was my historical interpretation. And we go into some details of my analysis. First, we have to check if there is any real possibility of a macro-cooperative body. I investigate various programmatic documents and summarize policy position of relevant actors in this figure. The point of my analysis lies in the two-dimensional structure of the figure itself. I detect and stress the difference in the reform conceptions of the labor movement's actors. Among them, some ideas stress the leading role of the government or the state, and others focus on the role of trade unions in decision-making process at the macroeconomic level. This difference cannot be reduced to the usual left versus right or radical or reformist scheme. For example, the free socialist current, which constitutes the core of the German Social Democrats after the 1960s, is moderate in the sense that they do not advocate nationalization of industry. And their policy instruments are mainly Keynesian. However, their ideas are fixed on the role of the state without considering the role of the trade unions, which is in stark contrast to the corporatist economic democracy conception of trade unionists. Here we see a free socialism in the center and a corporatist idea in the left bottom corner. And this difference has important implications. And the German Christian Democratic Party had, as I have said, a trade union faction, and Christian socialism is quite near to the corporatist conceptions of the some trade union leaders like Fristano. And to illustrate political possibility, I checked relevant articles in the state constitutions, which were enacted before the federal constitutions. And many constitutions contain articles on such corporatist macro-deliberated bodies. And an example is shown in the slide. It is noteworthy that the existence of such articles do not correspond to the strengths of the left. In many cases, they were codified by the compromise of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. In other words, this grand coalition type of political constellation was conducive to the realization of such ideas. This shows that the corporatism issue is rather a consensual issue in contrast to the socialization or economic planning. I show an article from the Landesverfassung, State Constitution of Württemberg-Baden. And this kind of article we can find in many state constitutions.
About 2 minutes left. Just,
okay.
Thanks.
Why such body was not institutionalized? In the party political arena, most important turning point were the decision was made by Social Democratic Party in 1970s, 1947 and 1949. And here they chose to play a role of constructive opposition in the wars. Further, even after the establishment of the first Adenauer government, there are some chances. Parity co-determination in coal and steel, but are prioritized by the unions in the debate focused around the Schuman Plan and the remilitarization. This is because there was a fait accompli already installed by the British military government. There was a co-determination scheme, and industrial in metal trade unions and also mining trade unions preferred to extend their privileges in exchange for the support for Adenauer government. Therefore, securing parity co-determination is traded for Adenauer government's foreign policy support, and macro corporatism was discarded in spite of agreement in principle. So, as a consequence, West German political economy resulted in a unique combination, a macro-level coordination almost lacking, and even the introduction of national economic accounting was rather late. Further, a trade union strategy shifted to industry level. Active wage policy led by the IG Metall had been the main strategic push for the trade unions, and the tariff autonomy, which prohibits the intervention of the state in wage negotiation, concept had become almost sacred in the policy discussion, which partly contribute to the demise of the Alliance for Jobs. Considering this the uniqueness, there is no wonder that the German approach has has been received with mixed feelings at the EU level. Sorry for long presentation, and that's all. Thank you.